Okay, everyone, welcome back to the Energeia podcast. I'm Dr. G, your hostess, with the mostess as always, and today I'll be speaking with David Sloan Wilson. David, for anyone even vaguely familiar with a latter-day understanding of the modern theory of evolution, will scarcely need much of an introduction, and my short introductory bio is hardly going to do his entire body of life's work anything like the justice it deserves, but he is an evolutionary biologist and a distinguished Emeritus Professor of Biological Sciences and Anthropology at SUNY Binghamton, as well as the original co-founder of the Evolution Institute, and more recently also co-founder of an offshoot non-profit initiative called Prosocial World, which we'll be discussing today. In evolutionary circles, David is perhaps most well known for being one of the most prominent proponents of multi-level selection theory, a framework which stands in contrast to the gene and individual level selection frameworks advocated for by other evolutionary theorists. And he is also a vocal and unabashed champion of the extended evolutionary synthesis within evolutionary theory more broadly. David has published dozens upon dozens of academic papers in not only evolutionary biology journals, but also numerous outlets within anthropology, psychology, ecology, and the philosophy of science, to name but a few disciplines that he's made a scholarly foray into. And he's also the author of Darwin's Cathedral, Evolution, Religion, and the Nature of Society, Evolution for Everyone, How Darwin's Theory Can Change the Way We Think About Our Lives, and Does Altruism Exist? Culture, Genes, and the Welfare of Others. His more recently published books for a popular audience include This View of Life, Completing the Darwinian Revolution, and Prosocial, Using Evolutionary Science to Build Productive, Equitable, and Collaborative Groups, which he co-authored with Paul Atkins and Stephen Hayes, who many among my audience will know as one of the originators of acceptance and commitment therapy within the cognitive and behavioral sciences. And more recently still, David has authored his first novel, Atlas Hugged, the autobiography of John Galt III, a book-length rejoinder to Ayn Rand's original Atlas Shrugged, which we'll be discussing today as well. And finally, his memoir, A Life Informed by Evolution, which was released this year. And so with that already lengthy but still vastly incomplete bio out of the way, David, my friend, good to see you again. Welcome along to the Energeia podcast, and thanks so much for being with me today.
Dr. G, nice to be with you.
Now, I've had the pleasure of getting to know and work with you a bit over the years, and many of my listeners will undoubtedly be familiar with you and your life's work. But in addition to what I already outlined in the introduction, could you please give us a bit more of your background as a scientist and public intellectual, and perhaps some of the most notable reflections about your own life that you've shared with the world in your recent memoir?
Well, increasingly, I think in historic terms, that when we think of the scientific revolution as going back to roughly the 1500s, and then Darwin's theory, 1859, that seems like a long time ago. But to think that the scientific revolution is still a work in progress, and that actually a great deal of it has taken place during the last 50 years, which is the span of my working lifetime, I think is a very important perspective to have. And the kind of things that we can say is that, of course, Darwin's theory was so revolutionary at the time, but for most of the 20th century, was only largely confined to biology and left out non-genetic forms of evolution, including human cultural evolution. That only started in the 1970s or 80s or so. We can call the last 70 years the age of individualism. So you mentioned, I'm known for championing multi-level selection against the view that everything that evolves is by individual level selection or gene level selection. And during that same period, when group selection was rejected, that was also the triumphant period of neoclassical economics. So all of economics could be explained as individual utility maximizing, and what was called methodological individualism in the social sciences. And so this idea that the individual is the fundamental unit, that all things social could be reduced to the individual, that was just a tide that lifted all boats. I mean, that's the proverbial water that the fish can't see of our culture. And the passing of that required, among other things, of course, complex systems theory, but complex systems theory couldn't get going until widespread computing. And there we are, once again, in the last quarter of the 20th century. And so much has happened recently that should be informing our thinking. And in many ways, I represent that. I was just, lucky. Like, the musicians that were at the dawn of rock and roll were lucky to be on the ground floor of something new. And I feel that I was lucky to be entering the field of evolutionary biology at a time when all of this has happened, and I'm proud to have contributed to some of it. But I think it's very important to have that historic perspective.
Randy Nesse, in his book Evolution and the Capacity for Commitment, described you as a, quote, tireless, outgoing scientist who has made group selection his life's mission. Now, just to continue on with a theme that you introduced there, I don't want to necessarily unearth the arguments and counter-arguments on this issue in a litigious, or perhaps it should be a re-litigious sort of way, but given the furor this idea still continues to raise on both sides of its divide, I wonder if you could give us a layman-level understandable overview of where you think multi-level selection stands now in 2022, theoretically and empirically, and from there, what are some of the most important practical implications and applications which follow from an acceptance of this theory's main premises?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I'll just describe the theory, which is so simple that it can be done in a minute or two. And then its relevance. So we'll compress this, although we don't need to. We have an hour together. But, the thing that Darwin confronted way back at the beginning, at first he thought his theory could explain all examples of design that had been attributed to a creator. And soon enough he realized that there was an exception to that, which was everything we consider good, virtuous, and moral. Everything done on behalf of others or society as a whole. And so if you think of these behaviors, which in general can be called prosocial, inherently they are vulnerable to behaviors that are more self-centered. And so if Darwin's theory of natural selection was about favoring individuals that survive and reproduce better than other individuals, yes, it can explain the eyesight of the hawk, the sharp teeth of the tiger, the thick fur of the polar bear. Those traits cause individuals to survive and reproduce better than other individuals. But the Good Samaritan, being honest instead of lying, and everything that counts as moral actually places that individual at a selective disadvantage compared to more self-serving behaviors. And that's shocking when you think of it, that this class of behaviors that we call prosocial were the one thing that Darwin could not explain by his theory until he added something new, and that was a process of selection at the level of groups. That even though selfishness beats altruism within groups of altruistic individuals robustly can outcompete groups of selfish individuals. And so everything that we associate with altruism and prosociality actually can evolve by the process of natural selection, but it is a process of group-level selection, not selection among individuals within groups. And as I summarized it with Ed Wilson, who recently passed away, in one of our major papers titled Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Sociobiology, selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups, everything else is commentary. I just did it. In 5 minutes, I explained the theory of multi-level selection. And by the way, on the online magazine, This View of Life, actually 12 years ago, I wrote a whole series of blogs called Truth and Reconciliation for Group Selection. And right now, those blogs are replaying on This View of Life. So if you go to thisviewoflife.com, you'll be able to drop in on my series, Truth and Reconciliation for Group Selection, which is now being rerun. And let me just continue, Gareth. I also had a conversation with Arvid Eglin, a Swedish biologist who wrote the very recent book, The Gene's Eye View of Evolution. And so there's a new book out, Oxford University Press, on the Gene's Eye View of Evolution. And I have a wonderful conversation with the author on all of this. And I have several conversations which I call master classes because, we don't spare the details. We really take a deep dive, although it's still accessible. So I think that if you view that conversation, you'll see that multi-level selection is thoroughly revived. There'll be some people that go to their graves, and Richard Dawkins will be among them. But for the most part, multi-level selection has become thoroughly respectable, especially for the case of human evolution. There, if you read authors such as Joseph Henrich or Kevin Leland or really anyone, Peter Turchin, anyone who thinks about human cultural evolution, you will find that they work in terms of multi-level selection. So it's back. And I feel like I'm taking too long, Gareth, but I'll finish up by saying where multi-level selection truly proves its worth is in the applications. And so now when we actually work with groups, small or large, such as what you do as a consultant and a coach, or what I do working with groups worldwide, all the way up to economics and political science, what nations do, the global village. And I have a new article that just came out literally days ago, although it's been years in the making, with the economist Dennis Snower. It's a 3-part article, and each part is long, titled Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Economics. And that new paradigm is the multi-level paradigm. You cannot think about human affairs without thinking about functional organization above the level of the individual at multiple levels, and the need to make those higher level units more functional than they are now. That's what policy is, ultimately at the global scale. And so multi-level selection becomes not optional. I mean, it becomes like the paradigmatic alternative to neoclassical economics and basically individualism in all of its forms. And so that's how strong it's back. And we'll cover more of that during our conversation.
Yeah, we'll certainly talk more about some of the practical applications of all this work very, very soon. Just quickly, likewise, not wanting to relitigate another belligerent biologist brouhaha here, but I also wonder if you might describe for us the extended evolutionary synthesis, what it is, what its most persistent criticisms are, and how you would answer those criticisms.
Yeah, so I'm happy to, Gareth. I find it kind of amusing. So first of all, what was the first synthesis, the modern synthesis in the 1940s? In retrospect, we can look back upon it. Of course, it was a synthesis, and so it gathered a whole bunch. You go back further than that, and you find things that, unless you're a historian, they're difficult to imagine. Did you know, for example, that when Mendel's work was rediscovered in the early 20th century, Mendelism was regarded as an alternative to Darwinism. People thought that Darwin was wrong and Mendel was right. And it wasn't until like the 1920s that there was a reconciliation, and so that Mendelism was integrated with Darwinism. And then the modern synthesis was basically that integration. So it was huge. I mean, and so we could note its positive side. And yet at the same time, what took place at that time, nobody really noted it as strongly as we need to note it now, is that the study of evolution had become entirely gene-centric. Without anyone really thinking about it, it was now the case that implicitly the only way that offspring can resemble their parents is by sharing genes that obey the laws of Mendelian inheritance. And so the great modern synthesis was also the great constriction in terms of evolution being only about genetic evolution. Textbooks described evolution, natural selection, as a change in gene frequency. And so around the world, when you say the word evolution, most people hear the word genes. And that's not how Darwin thought about it. He couldn't, because he knew nothing about genes. For Darwin, it was the triad of variation, selection, and replication. And so the extended evolutionary synthesis basically notes that we're going beyond, we're going, as I put it, back to basics. And we are now defining Darwinian evolution as any process that includes that triad, any process that includes variation, selection, and replication, no matter what the mechanisms. And at the same time, even genetic evolution has gone beyond Mendelian genetics. For example, it's not the case that mutations are random. Mutations are often a little bit directed, and it's not hard to explain why that might be. So even genetic evolution has advanced beyond the modern synthesis. And so there's every reason to say that evolutionary theory has gone beyond the modern synthesis. And the extended evolutionary synthesis is the most modest of terms. I mean, nobody's like beating their chest and saying, "Oh, there's a new synthesis." No, they're saying, "Oh, the modern synthesis can be extended." It's like the most diplomatic, judicious term that you could ever choose, and that was chosen by Massimo Puglisi, who is mainly the person who convened all of it. And still it was objectionable. Still you get people saying, "Oh, the synthesis doesn't need to be extended." And I find that laughable, because I think now the more we extend that synthesis, and the more we realize that the modern synthesis was, as I and others put it, the great constriction, leaving such things as human cultural evolution completely to other disciplines, then hell yes, you bet it's extended. In fact, it's new in so many ways that I would be much stronger in my choice of words. But so anyhow, there's a little piece on the extended evolutionary synthesis. And I'm not going to have another drink of beer.
No, yeah, well, no matter how much, you probably deserve it after that. I mean, no matter how anodyne and mealy-mouthed you might make the term itself, like you said earlier, there's going to be the holdouts that dig their heels in and go to the grave anyway. So I guess you can only keep on fighting the good fight on that front. But let's take things away now from these disputes between biologists. I want to talk now about some of the non-profit initiatives you've been involved in. As I mentioned at the top of the show, you were a co-founder of the Evolution Institute, but this has since spun off into a new initiative called Prosocial World. So would you tell us a bit about your history in these initiatives, both of them, and what are some of the primary objectives you're trying to achieve with the work that you're doing in Prosocial World, and perhaps also how interested people can get involved and help promote and participate in this work? Yeah,
really, thank you, Gareth, for the opportunity. And we do have engagement in mind, and especially the prosocial commons, which I'll mention now and then mention again. But to go back to the beginning, it took place at a number of stages. Stage one was that the more I appreciated the explanatory scope of evolution in my own work, the more I wanted to teach it. And often professors just want to do research. They regard teaching as a distraction. And I was kind of like that. But the more I appreciated the explanatory scope of evolutionary theory, especially for all things human, I wanted to teach it. And I didn't want to teach just a course. I wanted to teach a whole program, evolution across the curriculum. And so that's one of the first things I did. I created a interdisciplinary program at Binghamton University called EVOS for Evolutionary Studies. And that was wonderful. That's still going, actually. And one of the things we're doing, actually, is creating a global online EVOS. So that's one of the things we're doing with the Prosocial Commons that people can become involved in. So that was great, but it was still inside the ivory tower. It was just entirely on campus. And as someone who studied altruism and now had made a career out of showing how altruism can evolve by an evolutionary process, by between group selection, then it was kind of natural. And also as a field biologist, I spent much of my career studying non-human species. I studied insects, fish, birds, those kinds of creatures. And when you're a field biologist, you know that it just goes without saying that to study any species, you have to study it in its natural environment. And then laboratory experiments take place against that background. Not so with humans. And so when I started to study like human altruism, it was just like, I'd like to study this in the field, in the real world. Real people. Can I measure individual differences in their prosociality and their consequences? And so I started to work in my city of Binghamton. I called it the Binghamton Neighborhood Project. And working with the school system, I did exactly that. I measured individuals, how prosocial they were. You could ask me how, but just trust me. And they had a bell-shaped curve. Everything is a bell-shaped curve just about. And so what that means is that some individuals were like super prosocial. Some individuals were like super narcissistic, and most people were in between. And the fundamental prediction is that for prosociality to evolve in a Darwinian world, those who give must get. There must be some sense in which a prosocial individual associates with other prosocial individuals. There must be a correlation between the prosociality of the individual and the prosociality of the individual's social environment. And that's what we measured, and that's what we found. And so this was very exciting for me because now genetic evolution wasn't taking place, but it turns out that behavioral flexibility, everyone has a choice basically of whether in any particular situation to be, to do the right thing or to do the wrong thing. Everyone has that flexibility. And then what they express is in part based on their temperaments and so on, but to a large extent it's situational. That if you're in a situation, like when you're interacting with strangers, you tend not to be very nice because you don't know who they are. But if you're interacting with known individuals and they're trustworthy and so on and so forth, you can be nice because you're safe. You're pretty sure they'll be nice back to you. This is not rocket science. And so the way we behave as individuals is very much conditioned upon our environments where we're living in. And so the fact that this could be evolutionary meant that you could do something about it. You could actually alter the social environment, and you could get people who are, and I just wrote a piece on this, Gareth, using turtles as I call it the parable of the turtles. We're just like turtles. When we feel unsafe, we pull into our shells. We don't cooperate. When we feel safe, we come out of our shells. And so let's make safe environments. Well, people come out of their shells. Let's do that. And so we did in a school and in some neighborhoods. And so that was a beginning. And then just to finish up, as soon as I saw the potential for that in my city of Binghamton, I saw the potential for that worldwide. And so when I had an opportunity to create a think tank with Jerry Lieberman, who approached me and said, would you like to create a think tank? I said, yeah, I do. And so that was the Evolution Institute. And then my projects within the Evolution Institute became sufficiently active, basically, and grew to the point where they needed to spin off amicably. So the Evolution Institute still exists. So 2 years ago, we became Prosocial World, and now we're just growing like crazy. And so we really have the wherewithal to, as we put it in our mission statement, to consciously evolve a world that works for all. We can steward cultural evolution. Wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever your starting situation, we can help you become more prosocial and more adaptable. Yes, we can do that, and we're happy to work with you.
And it's so great that you've got the capacity and just the motivation and the support behind you to be able to lead an initiative like this. And I mean, just relatedly, you've also been active with the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. And I understand there's been something of a rejuvenation of an evolutionary science special interest group within that association. So tell us about this special interest group and what its efforts are being targeted towards.
Well, actually, Gareth, as Dr. G, as I threatened to do, I think it's time to turn the tables and for you to talk about your entry into this, because we've been working for, 5-6 years. We first met each other, and then we started to work with business consultants and so on. So I think you should tell your story. You've already said that you were once an Ayn Rand fan, and then you had your encounter with ACBS and so on. And I think you should just tell your story and bring it up to date, and then this will be an even more interesting conversation.
Sure thing. Well, I mean, that pushes us forward to something I was definitely going to discuss with you with your novel Atlas Hugged. I was especially excited to talk about this area with you, because this is your literary antidote to Ayn Rand and her philosophy of objectivism. So I read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged and some of Rand's other works when I was in my early 20s, just at an impressionable age where grand, lofty ideas of many kinds kind of just landed with me in a very visceral way. And I've now, 20 years hence, long since outgrown Rand's work in the main. Politically speaking, I lean libertarian in some ways, but not in a drowning in the Kool-Aid, objectivist, hyper-neoliberalist sort of way. And I recognize that Rand's philosophy is not anywhere near an ideal framework for designing a society. I believe it was Sam Harris, perhaps a little insensitively, who said something along the lines of, it would be like using autism as a philosophy for social development. And yet, just like with, say, Friedrich Nietzsche and some other old-timey philosophers who really revved me up as a young man, but who are more of a curiosity for me now in my 40s, there are still some residual elements of Rand's general philosophy which do appeal to me. I do like the notion of existing for my own sake, and that is an end in itself. I don't like legitimate bottom feeders, not the people who are not the truly unfortunate and downtrodden at the bottom of society who need all our help and support, but the people who would engage in a willful kind of bottom feeding. I resent those people mooching off of my industry and enterprise. And I still believe ultimately that most things that can be handled by the private sector should be handled by the private sector. And so something that you said to me one time when we were hanging out in Chicago with some colleagues shooting the breeze really stuck with me. We were all discussing, I can't remember which theory it was, but we were discussing some particular scientific theory that we were all collectively questioning, if not repudiating. And you said something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing, with any theory or philosophy, we must be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So, I mean, I want to ask you, maybe just like you could talk about this in terms of like how I've evolved, or maybe I haven't evolved on this issue. But given what you've written in Atlas Hugged, I mean, is there any baby there remaining that's worth holding on to in the process of emptying all this bathwater.
Yeah, there is. Big time. Big time. And there the figure to bring in is Elinor Ostrom, in part because she's a libertarian hero. I've spent quite a bit time talking with Peter Boetke, who's at the Emeritus Center of George Mason University. And that's ground zero for libertarianism. And there at the Hayek Center for Advanced Study, there's Friedrich Hayek on the wall and Elinor Ostrom on the wall. And so let's talk about Elinor Ostrom, what she did. She studied groups that attempt to manage common pool resources, as you know. So that she studied basically the famous tragedy of the commons, the tendency of groups to overexploit their resources. Those are your bottom feeders, basically, the ones who are taking more than their share of the resource. And received wisdom was that the tragedy will always occur. The only solution is to privatize the resource or to regulate it, to do top-down regulation. What she showed by actually studying them is that in the first place, they varied in how well they were able to avoid the tragedy of the commons. They didn't all avoid it or commit it. There was variation. And the best, the ones that were able to self-manage, did so by implementing certain core design principles. And those core design principles, I think I'm not going to list them at this moment, but one of the things that you can say about them is that they prevent bottom feeding, to use your term. And because this is not, and I worked with Lynn to generalize the core design principles because they map so very clearly onto multi-level selection. Remember what I said about selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups. And so if you look at the core design principles, what they do is they make it hard to be a bottom feeder. In the first place, they define the group, they define who's in the group, they make sure that the benefits are proportional for costs, they make sure decision-making is fair, they create that safe environment that I was talking about. They monitor agreed-upon behavior. If someone's not doing what they should, that you catch that, and then you prevent it from happening. You have good conflict resolution mechanisms. And then the seventh one, local autonomy, is, again, this is why she's a hero of libertarians. It just means the group should not be bossed around by other groups, much less the state. And so the idea that, please let the government get out of the way, we want to do things our own way, is one reason why she's a libertarian hero. And so, but look at how strange this is, Gareth, because on the one hand, this is very much exemplifying libertarian values, but at the same time, it is incredibly highly regulated within the group. If you want to talk about regulations, then the Ostromian group is among the most highly regulated of any group. You can't do anything you want in an Ostromian group. You have to do what the group is there to do. And so isn't it curious that on the one hand, we're emphasizing the value of small groups, or at least appropriately sized groups, and not being bullied, avoiding bottom feeding and exploitation and free riding and all of their forms, rewarding initiative. And these are all these kind of libertarian values, and yet at the same time, to do that well, it's incredibly regulatory. I mean, it's the most interesting juxtaposition of libertarian values and their alternates that you could ask for, but it's the magic combination. And then also, a very important part of the Ostromian worldview is called polycentric governance. Here it is. It says that life consists of many spheres of activity. Who could disagree with that? Each sphere has an optimal scale. Who could disagree with that? Good governance therefore requires finding the optimal scale for each sphere of activity and appropriately coordinating among the scales. Who could disagree with that? And so, but if you take polycentric governance seriously, it enables you to make statements such as, well, big government isn't good all the time. Can I swear? It's fucking good some of the time. In fact, we really need it some of the time. And so therefore you can't just say blanket statements like, government bad, free market good. Give me a break. And so you have smart people like Mariana Mazzucato, the Italian economist, who says smart things about the state as being very effective at such things as entrepreneurship. And she has books and books written on the fact that you look at what we associate with private enterprise, like Silicon Valley and Elon Musk and Steve Jobs and so on. You want to know the government involvement and the government subsidies of just about everything that we associate with innovation? So give me a break. So it goes on like that. Cheers.
Cheers to that. I mean, to me, for both people who might broadly self-identify as libertarians or broadly self-identify as socialists or democratic socialists or whatever it might be, it just seems like, especially in the United States, everyone is just too wedded to their camps to see the nuance in an explanation like this, that this is a system where both of those camps, if they only, decamped themselves perhaps, could actually find a lot more mutual ground than they might imagine. It just seems to me, I'll be interested to hear your perspective on this, but to me, everyone's been talking about the division and the polarization in the United States at the moment. My wife's American, she's looking on aghast at the way things are going back home. I mean, could something like Ostromian principles, in an ideal sense, could this be what, an initiative, an approach that could be used to maybe close this schism that we see in evidence now in the United States in particular? Not exclusively in the United States, but I think the United States is obviously the most radioactive example of this kind of social schism in play. Do you think an Ostromian approach is what's needed in a country like the US to heal and to reconcile?
Well, it's what's needed worldwide. There's point one. Point two, that's the whole point. And my article with Dennis Noah, Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Economics, is working towards that. There's other content, especially a series that's on this view of life titled Evolution, Complexity, and the Third Way of Entrepreneurship. And what that series shows, and this is so compelling, and the point to make is that this ends up being a kind of very commonsensical in retrospect. I always like to point out that nothing is obvious all by itself, only against the background of other ideas. There's nothing as obvious all by itself. And so against this new background, then some things are obvious, including what I'm about to say. There's two things that don't work, and only one thing that can work. One thing that doesn't work is socialism, you'll be happy to know. Why? Because, or centralized planning. And by the way, some of the worst offenders of socialism and centralized planning are corporations, which is very ironic. So it's not just socialist nations. It's any corporation which employs a command and control organization is like a socialist nation. And the reason it doesn't work, the reason centralized planning doesn't work, is because the world is too complex. No, it's too complex for any experts to formulate some grand plan and implement it. There will always be unforeseen consequences. So forget about centralized planning. It won't work. What's the other thing that doesn't work? Laissez-faire. It's just not the case that everyone pursuing their separate interests is going to work out for the common good. That's stupid. And if that's what you mean by the invisible hand metaphor, well, that's just dumb. So it won't happen. And then multi-level selection theory tells you that very, very clearly. And let me just make a distinction, Gareth, because it's very important. It gets a little bit more technical. But it's so very important. There's a key phrase, complex adaptive system. So if you're into complex systems theory, you know that phrase, complex adaptive system. But there's two meanings. that need to be distinguished, meaning one, a complex system that is adaptive as a system. An organism would be a good example. Meaning number two, a complex system composed of agents following their respective adaptive strategies. A complex system composed of agents following their respective adaptive strategies. An ecosystem would be like that, or a human economy. An unregulated city would be like that. Look at driving as a great example. If you have just people making their individual driving decisions, you're not going to get smooth traffic flow. Who would expect that? You have to have some kind of system that is constructed so that when people make their individual driving decisions within the system, then it works well. But the system had to be designed with the welfare of the whole system in mind. And so what we need is the first meaning of complex adaptive systems, systems that work well as systems. What we most often have are a system composed of agents following their respective adaptive strategies. The whole goal is to create CAS-1 systems out of CAS-2 systems. That's how you frame it in a complex systems vocabulary. And so that's why centralized planning doesn't work, laissez-faire doesn't work. The only thing that works is a carefully stewarded process of cultural evolution. We experiment. First of all, we have systemic goals in mind. We want a smart city. We want a neighborhood that works well. We want to do something about global warming. We want equity. We want something systemic. And then that becomes the target. And then we experiment. What does that mean? We do different things. There's your variation. Your target is the selection. The experimentation is the variation. And then we replicate the practices that work well, realizing that they're highly contextual. So what works here, there's not a cookie cutter solution. What works here might not work there. You have to tinker with it, more evolution. And so the only thing that works and ever has worked, no matter how it's been conceptualized, is a pragmatic experimentation process with systemic goals in mind. And then if you look at examples of positive cultural change, which we do in this series, it doesn't matter whether it's like entrepreneurship or development or national governance or it doesn't matter. What you'll find is that what works and what sometimes is converged upon is this process of cultural evolution with systemic goals. And so knowing that, we can do it much better by being explicit about it. We're really seeing that as for what it is a managed process or a stewarded process of cultural evolution. That's what's needed at all scales, from the single individual, which brings us to ACT, so we could go in that direction. That basically ACT is as managed personal evolution, all the way up to economics, rethinking the theoretical foundation of economics.
Just to take that thinking and apply it to the level of the business, and to take things back to Prosocial World for a moment. The book Prosocial that you co-authored with Stephen Hayes and Paul Atkins, this has had a huge impact on my own thinking about group dynamics, group behavior. I mean, especially as it relates to the inevitable nature of conflict, how teams can best harness conflict's more generative potential while also sort of triaging its more damaging, dysfunctional excesses. And I've actually, here in a highly centrally planned country like Vietnam, I've actually started assigning this book as required reading in both my undergraduate organizational behavior and management classes, as well as my MBA leadership classes. And it's really resonated with so many of my students. But for you though, just to take this to the level of focusing on businesses and making organizations better, as someone who's spent so much of their life and career considering the nature of groups, how humans behave in groups, what do you think are the main takeaways that a modern business organization in the year 2022 specifically can derive and hopefully apply by reading this book, following Ostromian principles and absorbing its main premises?
Yeah, so I want to point out, so you're in Vietnam, right?
Yes, sir.
And so we have a project with the Plum Village Monastery in France, which was founded by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese beloved Zen monk who just passed away. And so, do you know, some of your listeners, our viewers, might find it interesting that we could take this conversation in the direction of spirituality real fast. And I will. But back to business. But really, what I just said, that what we're talking about, look at its portability. Look at how it moves. From spirituality to business to psychology to everywhere, everything. And that's the theme of Atlas Hugged, is basically this theory can explain everything. And yet it's not a cult. So that's so very interesting to think about. But once again, Gareth, I want to learn more about your actual practice. I mean, tell me, in quite a bit of detail, what you're doing there in Vietnam. Are you associated with the university? Do you have a practice? Who are your clients? Tell me more about that, because I think that I can kind of orient the conversation in the most useful way that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, at the beginning of last year, I launched Energeia Coaching, which is my coaching and consulting practice. So I work with individuals and groups all over the world, doing one-on-one coaching, team coaching, leadership development. I partner with human resource management departments in different companies across the world, and work with people mostly on their career development, but also on their sort of whole of life development as well. And my side gig is I work at both the University of Economics, Ho Chi Minh City, where I work in their International School of Business. I teach management to undergraduates. I teach organizational behavior to undergraduates. And I also work at Western Sydney University, their Vietnam campus, where I teach leadership at the MBA level. And I mean, as it relates to evolution, and maybe this is something that you could share a perspective on, I think that for me, evolutionary mismatch, especially for one-on-one coaching, is an especially persuasive idea to lay people. The broad idea that humans are so far removed from, let's say, an original state of nature, that the world that we live in now, we have been so transplanted out of what our species kind of was adapted for, to maybe oversimplify it, and find ourselves in this world now where, we are bombarded with information at every turn. We are bombarded with bad food and bad ideas and bad incentives to stay healthy, and all the rest of it. This idea lands with people a lot. The idea that modern life is kind of alien to a human in its state of nature. I for many of my clients, they find this idea especially persuasive. And then for my students and for my clients that I work with in groups.
Yeah, you froze there, so pick up from where you were.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, I think there's something just about the formidability and the durability and the popular widespread acceptance of evolutionary theory generally, which gives people good grounds to think, well, if you invoke evolutionary principles to talk about not only individual development but group development, there must be some real substance behind it. And so for me, in my line of work, I've actually had I don't invoke evolution at every single turn. For some clients, it's not relevant or not,
Sure.
not maybe directly relevant. But for the vast majority of people I've spoken with, this framing or the evolutionary framing more generally is especially persuasive. It is especially compelling, and this is why I think I'm interested in your take on as someone whose life's work has been devoted to groups and using evolutionary theory to better understand and improve groups, for me as a professional coach and an individual development specialist, my own bread and butter is mostly focused on that micro level of analysis. And, a lot of this work is sort of predicated on the idea that people don't merely exist as a part of the groups they're a member of, that people cannot be exclusively and exhaustively defined by their kinship with other people, and that the only person who knows exactly what it's like to be you yourself is you. You're the only person that has or could have the requisite familiarity with the requisite operational hardware and software. So, and I'd be very interested to hear your take on this. I mean, in my view, there is a positive, healthy, functional, and necessary version of, let's say, egoism or self-centeredness. Perhaps there's a better term we could use, but something which we all ought to embrace and pursue so that we can develop in our own right as unique, distinctive beings, to have a genuinely, self-propelled drive toward achievement and accomplishment. So I just wonder what your take on all of that is in general, and maybe also what you think might be some of the applications that I've either not mentioned just then or that perhaps I haven't thought about of evolutionary theory to that micro level of analysis, particularly with respect to improving aspects of business and organizations through things like coaching and leadership development and employee development and so forth.
Yeah, it's very deep. And there's so much to say. So, by the way, I'm happy to do this again, Gareth, because we'll never cover everything. But when we look at mismatch, often
absolutely happy to have you back on each and any time, my friend.
So, well, I mean, I have the kind of zeal of an evangelical preacher, and I'm unapologetic about that. I have good news for you. I have...
time to spread the gospel.
I mean, there's so much to be said. I mean, you cited my book Darwin's Cathedral, in which I basically evolutionary religion and the nature of society, and I've learned so much by studying religions and admiring them for their ability to form community. That's a magnificent thing. And Emil Durkheim got it right when he told the essence of religion is not belief in supernatural agents. It's the formation of strong moral communities, which involves the concept of the sacred. I don't have to traffic with the gods in order to make use of that insight. But back to mismatch, I think that, as you know, Gareth, there's the strongest, what most people associate with evolutionary psychology is very gene-centric. This is the work that's, the names include Cosmides, Leda Cosmides, and John Tooby, David Buss, folks like that. This was a school of thought that burst upon the scene in the 1990s. And basically what it said is that, our brains are, it's not a single computer. It's many, many specialized modules that evolve by genetic evolution. And then mismatch is the mismatch between our modern environment and our genetically evolved adaptations. Now, that's not wrong, but it's enriched when we expand the view of evolution to include all variation, selection, replication processes, because now we see that evolution is taking place at different timescales. There's genetic evolution, yes there is. Then there's cultural evolution, which can be actually quite slow, I mean, some examples of cultural evolution take centuries and millennia. I mean, there's lots about the current day. If you look at the history of basically the field of historical economics, when you look at the economic systems of today, sometimes you have to go back 1,000 years in order to understand why they exist, because that's how slow cultural evolution is. So cultural evolution, actually, genetic evolution can be fast or slow. Cultural evolution can be fast or slow. And then there's personal evolution when we think of that. And so what's basically makes much richer is to think of evolution, these evolutionary processes taking place at a range of timescales. And in each and every case, there could be mismatch. So when you ask the question, are we mismatched? Is a given person or a given group mismatched to their current environment? Well, you're going to have to examine examine evolution, all of those time scales. It's not just a matter of the Stone Age mind. I'm sorry, it's more complex than that. And then training and therapy becomes basically very much an exploration of what is the mismatch. And what that means in plain English, you don't have to use the E word. What the fuck isn't working well? And what are you trying to do anyhow? What are you, as an individual, what are your positive, what are your New Year's resolutions as a individual? What's your strategic plan as a group? I hope it's not predatory. I hope you're the kind of group that's actually trying to, do good, do no harm, don't be evil. I hope you're that kind of group. And if you are, then, we need to work on that. And I'm certainly not going to help you do harm. So prosociality exists at multiple scales. What's good for, and you made that point, Gareth, yourself. I make it by saying, self-interest, self-care is a great thing until it becomes self-dealing. Helping family and friends is a great thing until it becomes cronyism and nepotism, and so on. So these lower level entities, of course we want them to be strong and thriving, all the way down to the individual. You don't have to be self-sacrificial about this. You just need to be part of something larger than yourself. And that's where spirituality and the concept of the sacredness comes in. Really, in one way or another, you should be thinking, there's something that's more important than me, and I want to serve that. And every group, no matter how secular, they won't use that language. But if you look at a business group or any kind of group that you work with, why do they exist as a group? It's to do something together. And in that context, that thing is more important than yourself. Yes, that is more important than you. And you're serving it by virtue of being a member of that group. And as to whether you want to use spiritual language or not, that's something we can discuss. But so against that background, when you are working with clients, and here's another point I want to make, and it's like, it's a manifestation of individualism that is very systemic and quite cryptic, the kind of thing we're doing without knowing that we're doing, and really needs to be brought into the open. Namely, that in your position, I can put this question to you. How often is your client an individual as opposed to a group? And by group, I mean a group that actually exists as a group and is trying to do something as a group. And though I'm eager for your answer to that question, but I know from experience that many people who are in management and business and consulting of all kinds, especially in psychotherapy or in coaching, they're dealing with an individual. They're not dealing with a group that's functioning as a group. Their only point of access is with an individual. And that point of access isn't even that much at all, an hour a week or a training, or it's in and out, basically, as opposed to some ongoing relationship. And so basically the entire practice and expectation suffers from individualism, as if that's the right unit you should be interacting with. The fact is that you should be interacting with the groups that are actually trying to get something done as groups, and that should be an ongoing interaction, not in and out training, continuous improvement, continuous communication with groups, and not just internally, but in their interactions with other groups. That's how you build it up the scale. And so that's a radically different model I deal a lot with people in business and management, and I've been frankly quite disparaging lately. And I was shocked when I learned it, that, you might be a professor in a business school or a management school, and I thought, surely you have access to businesses and other organizations where you could actually work with them on an ongoing basis. You could partner with them to help manage, or we use the word steward, not manage, because manage has that top-down feel. Steward has that service feel. So we use the word steward. Surely you have that kind of relationship with businesses. I've discovered hardly ever do they have that kind of relationship. And that's in part because the groups that they work with are so damn busy doing what they're doing. They're just keeping their nose above water. They don't think they can take more on. And so the entire mindset of so many organizations is non-reflective. They're just not in a position to really step back and to think in any deep sense of changing the way that they do things. And so what we must work for, but nevertheless that's what we must work towards. And so that's what we're trying to do in Prosocial World. And very often it's an uphill battle because the clients we work with, it's a new model. So the closest, Gareth, that we can get to it is sports teams. I think sports teams are so interesting to reflect upon because so clearly they must function as groups. I mean, it goes without saying that the coaching that takes place at a sports team is coaching the entire group. And the individuals get coached as well, both physical plus and mental, but it's always in the context of the team working well. And so with sports teams, we have a bit of a model. So we need to extend that model. And in fact, that would be quite useful because, that's an attractive model. People are into sports. And so to think that and they already use the sports metaphors to some extent, but they would need to do so much more. That's the kind of coaching that's needed. And I don't know if you're actually embracing that, if you're succeeding, or if that's even what you have in mind when you work with your clients.
No, I actually think the analogy with sports teams is a very, very apt one. And in fact, I mean, a much more basic analogy I use with a lot of my clients is the analogy of fixing your own seatbelt first before you assist others on a plane. So that the whole motivation behind self-care and coaching people to take better care of themselves and to develop themselves, even though I still see that as an end in its own right, ultimately that is to serve and to benefit others, because you do live in the world, because you do live in groups, you do work in an organization, you are in a team, you do have a family. You're not, I mean, to your point about, the misguided mindset of so much business, everything, so much about business is so atomized. It's not even individualistic. It's individualistic at this level where, the realities of group dynamics and how people are embedded in groups, they might not be explicitly ignored, but they're effectively ignored by the way that we train people and the way that we coach people and so forth. And so, I mean, my whole approach is I'm here, if I'm working one-on-one with a client, I'm here to work one-on-one with you. Ultimately, my interest is not in developing your groups directly, but indirectly. I'm here to help develop you so that you can go out and become of greater service to the groups that you're embedded in. And, for a lot of my clients, it's a case of they come and see a coach because they want there's a dual purpose of, wanting to find their purpose or their passion or trying to find a career path that better suits them, which, by the way, then obviously benefits their families and benefits their communities if they're in a job where they're happy and healthy and everything like that. But it's also a case of helping them improve their mental health, because your mental health and having optimal mental health is of service to your community and the groups that you're embedded in. I mean, the thing is, if we're going to truly achieve a society where we can improve where we can apply these like Ostromian principles and these pro-social principles and so forth, we need to have capable people that are up to the challenge of implementing those principles. And so at that micro level, that's where I kind of see my role being, like to help people improve in their own right so they can go out and be better applicants of those principles in the real world, in the groups that they are a part of.
Yeah, well, there's a real tension. That's useful, Gareth, and I think that, I think people will benefit from that kind of, there's nothing that you said that's against what I've been saying. There's a kind of a tension between the entire concept of leadership, as typically conceptualized, and the Ostrom core design principle. So, I mean, the standard concept of leadership is inherently hierarchical. Basically, the leader has some power more than members of the group, and we hope that they use the power widely, but there's something that's sort of authoritarian about the very concept of leadership. And then when you look at the core design principles, it's all about accountability and equity and decision making and just about everything. And so in an Ostromian group, there's a lot of bottom-up control, because leaders are more prone to misbehave than anyone else, because they have the power to do so. And so if they have that power and we're just relying on their goodwill or their the training that you gave them in order to do the right thing, that's pretty fragile. And members of the group will be pretty quick to notice that. And so the best test of a group is one that's really designed so that to be exploitation proof, even among the leaders. And so what do you do when you're in leadership training and you're dealing with people that typically have that power, and you're telling them, what can you do to be a good leader? And what you really need to be telling them is, well, actually, you need to be giving power away. You need to be actually subordinating yourself and functioning as some kind of servant leader, a steward, or something like that. And to be authentic, then there has to be genuine transparency. You cannot make 300 times more than the average member of your group. That's obscene. There has to be a sense in which what you get from the group, even as a leader, is proportional to what you give to the group. And this is all basically involves ceding power in order to, and that's a hard thing to do. If you have power, there's a lot of people that don't want to cede it. So, and that's one reason why the core design principles aren't implemented more widely, is because there are people, members of the group, that are privileging themselves from the group, and they wouldn't want it any other way. So that's one reason why, selfishness beats altruism within groups. That's the process that's occurring, and then implementing the core design principle suppresses that, so that now the group can function as a unit, because anyone within a strong Ostromian group, all they have to do is look around and they say, this is a safe place. I could put in a good effort in this group. If I do, I'll be recognized for it. I'll benefit from my own efforts along with everyone else. Sure, I mean, I'm happy to extend myself in this group. But if they're not in place, then like a good turtle, they'll say, no, I don't know. I can see this going wrong. And then this is all largely unconscious. I describe it like a conscious process. But mostly it's just, here's an example, Gareth, that I use in my article titled, what's the title? Constructing Prosocial Groups, The Parable of the Turtle. And an experiment that my former graduate student, Dan O'Brien, did. He showed photographs of good versus bad neighborhoods to the participants in the experiment, college students. They viewed a photograph of a neighborhood, which might be good or bad. And then they played an experimental economics game with a resident of that neighborhood. It was all done on paper, so you didn't actually meet the person, but still the game was played, in which you could either cooperate or not in this experimental economic game. And viewing the photograph had a huge effect. They saw a nice neighborhood and they cooperated. They saw a bad neighborhood, they didn't. 30 seconds. That's the decision, and it's probably unconscious. It actually doesn't matter whether it was conscious or. That's the degree to which people sense their social environments and either extend themselves or not, like any sensible turtle. And so when you put it like that, I think, to me, it's so compelling. And it's instantaneous, just the way it was in that photograph. And so you should think of the core design principles as like a good neighborhood. And you should think of a person who enters that a group which has the core design principles as someone looking at a photograph. They look at it, or they sense it, and they realize it's safe, and they come out of their shell. And so what's amazing about that, which is a testable hypothesis, is that you could actually create groups that implement the core design principles, and you don't have to tell anyone. And you just put people in that group, and that group will function better. It will be instantaneous. Is that amazing or what? You don't have to do mind games or therapy or anything.
No.
I mean, wouldn't the whole world want to know about this? I mean, it's incredible when you think about it, and it's just there in front of our faces. But of course, nothing is obvious all by itself, as I've already said. And so, if your idea of business is Milton Friedman, then you will not see that. You will not see that. But if you have Ostrom in your head, you will see it, and you'll do it, and life will be better for it. And everything I just said goes for your families, for your neighborhoods, for your schools, for your churches, any group that requires cooperation. That's why a better world is right there.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You mentioned the concepts of authentic and servant leadership before, and I feel like in a scenario that you've just described, where you have a group in front of you, you're a leader that has a group in front of you that does follow these core design principles, you're, again, happening at an unconscious level, the likelihood is your authentic approach to leadership there is one that authentically embraces the group, one that one that actually authentically embraces the idea of the servant leader. And as you sort of alluded to, I think we're just in a situation now where systemically, and again, probably operating below the threshold of consciousness, but systemically, leaders don't have that incentive structure in place to naturally authentically land upon this approach of the servant leader. The system is set up for them to, like you said, it's almost like the business landscape is the equivalent of the bad neighborhood in the photograph that you described. And so leaders unconsciously are sort of hitting upon this idea, well, maybe it is just me out for myself, and it is this atomized view of leadership that I should be pursuing, and I shouldn't have this servant leader approach. Would you sort of broadly agree with that?
Yeah, totally. And so there's a whole kind of cultural sea change that has to take place, which is what we're seeking to do with rethinking the theoretical foundation of economics. And so I agree with you wholeheartedly. Yet I think that the results speak for themselves. And so, and in fact, the results are out there. One of the things that Paul Atkins did, my co-author and co-founder of Prosocial World, was a fairly thorough review of the sprawling management literature. And Ostrom is little known in the management literature, so nobody really cites Ostrom by name. But if you go down to each of the core design principles, You can find lots of stuff in the management literature that addresses those core design principles. That's what Paul did. And it's like, you don't have to do a single additional study. I mean, there's like meta-analysis upon meta-analysis that shows that organizations, business and other organizations that implement these core design principles do better. I mean, it's such a no-brainer after you see it the right way. And one of my favorite examples, Jeffrey Pfeffer is a well-known business school professor at Stanford Business School, and he wrote a book called The Human Equation in 1990, which covered all this stuff. You know, that book alone in 1990, what's 22 years ago, just crushes you with data. And one of the studies he cited was a study of companies that went public on the stock exchange, so they have information, public information about them. And then you could measure basically what kind of good deal they offered their employees, how equitable they were with their employees. And it just followed this cohort of companies for 5 years to see which ones still were in existence 5 years later. I mean, if this isn't survival and reproduction, what would be? And a very, very strong correlation with doing well by your employees and just being there 5 years later. I mean, okay. So, I mean, and so the real wonder there is why, I mean, there's creative destruction for you. There's Schumpeter's creative destruction. So why is it that this didn't have the expected effect of all businesses doing well by their employees? That didn't happen, despite that effect. And you can only look at two things. One is that those businesses which went under were still working well for the elites. So, you could understand things in terms of the benefit of the elites, not the benefit of the whole group. Or the whole shareholder value model as just a kind of a blinding influence, that people were under the spell of Milton Friedman. And so they couldn't see what was in front of their faces. So I think those are the two explanations for why the core design principles could be so manifestly important, abundantly documented in the management literature. There's really no point in doing additional research, frankly. Just review the existing literature from the right perspective, and yet still, this is not what everyone does. I mean, it's much to reflect upon there.
Well, I mean, you can only lead a horse to water, right?
I don't know, but but once you see it, and enough people see it, then there will be a tipping point. And this is why I'm optimistic that even though it seems like the orthodox economic paradigm has seemed such a citadel, so impervious to change all these years, actually that change can happen, and I believe is happening. So that makes it an exciting time. I think we can see change happening quite fast. I mean, people are ready for it. I mean, nobody likes what's happening in the world. They know it's not working. So please, let's have some new ideas. And these new ideas are very compelling. So we've really got an alternative to implement.
And maybe just to bring us on, and I really appreciate you being so generous with your time already. I just want to, just on that note, just segue into just a final question I want to put to you, and about the potential with all of the above to sort of transform and reshape the world for the better. You co-authored, along with a sort of veritable who's who of evolutionary luminaries, a paper a couple of years back in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences entitled "The Pandemic Exposes Human Nature." I'm not sure how much you contributed to that, but I know that you've commented on this most topical of topics on other platforms as well. But as both a scientist and, a public intellectual, and as just another human living through this time in human history, I wonder if you might share any of your general reflections on the COVID-19 pandemic, or given all that you've come to know and understand about the world and the people in it, everything that you've said in our time today, and thanks to a life informed by evolution.
Well, I think COVID is another example of the need for worldwide cooperation. On top of climate change and now global warfare and so much else. So everything boils down to the need for global cooperation and its absence. And so if you look at COVID as an example of that, in some ways it's like a natural experiment. And for example, one thing you can study, there was not a global response. Well, actually, cancel that. I think one nice thing you can say about the worldwide scientific community is that it is global. And so to some extent, not nearly as much as we needed, but to some extent, the scientists and so on, they were collaborating globally. Just think of the data taking, think of the record keeping, just so that we would know that a given nation has a degree of incidence. That basic fact gathering, which is, we tend to trust that. We tend to trust our numbers too much. When we say, we look at the graphs and stuff like that, we trust them perhaps more than we should, but to the degree that they are trustworthy, just think of the mechanisms and the institutions that were in place to accurately gather that kind of information. And so the glass of global cooperation is at least a little bit full. But then, of course, it's also largely empty. Now, if we shrink down to the national scale, so now we're not thinking about global cooperation, we're thinking about how any nation got its act together. What you find is a huge amount of variation, as we know, but that variation is actually quite nicely explained from a cultural evolutionary perspective. And Michelle Gelfand, who is one of the authors of that special issue, has an article on that. She distinguishes between tight and loose cultures. A tight culture is strong norms strongly enforced, and a loose culture provides much more elbow room for their members to do what they want. They both have advantages in different contexts, but in any context that requires solidarity, people working in a coordinated fashion, then it's the tight cultures that do better than the loose cultures, and that's what you find. And so you find Korea, for example, is a tight culture, and that had a magnificent coordinated response early on. Not so Brazil, not so America, not so Italy, not so the UK, more so Norway. Although Sweden, interestingly enough, had a coordinated response in the wrong direction. They made a bad judgment call, but it was coordinated. So
even when it went against type, that one somewhat.
Yeah, and they didn't actually back down, and so it's that complex. But the point is that our theory, our cultural evolutionary theory, is quite explanatory, and we've learned a lot. I mean, I don't know whether to be impressed or unimpressed by what took place. There's some extent when you think that what was required over a period of only 1, 2, 3 years. It's quite astonishing how collective action did take place. And to the degree that it didn't, it had to do with social identities. Back to America, where now the reason it didn't take place was just because there were people that became dead set against it. And it became literally a symbolic marker of who you are that you didn't do these. And then we have these epidemics of misinformation, and so there's issues of free speech and fake news, and which all requires explanation. The fact that when it comes to selection, and all the social media companies, which are basically profit motivated, so their target of selection isn't the common good, it's their profits. And if they can drive profits, with clicks and advertising and things like that, they're doing very well. Thank you very much. It's a classic example of, for the good of the group is a good thing until it creates problems higher up the scale. We're awash with that now, and one reason we find it difficult to control is because we're still under the spell of some kind of laissez-faire model, which we think it's right and good for Facebook to be maximizing its profit. The invisible hand will take care of that. So there's, we're still under the spell of a bad theory in terms of some of these things that are happening. And then if we switch to the Ukraine, I think that who knows how that's going to turn out, but there's some grounds for optimism in the sense that the world has become interconnected enough that when you get a predatory action like that, which was, of course, the norm 300 years ago, that's the only thing that ever happened in past centuries, was that predatory kind of conduct among nations. But now when it happens, there's enough interconnectedness that maybe it won't work. And it won't work because just all the other agents, including not just the nations, but the corporations and so many entities, actually were able to fight back, not militarily, but to constrain that kind of bottom feeding, to use your term, action. It could turn out that way, in which case that kind of bad behavior could be a thing of the past. So we don't know if that's how it will turn out, but it could. And people are talking about that. That's just not me talking. There's lots of commentary along those lines. So let there be more of that. That we could, without adopting military tactics, we could actually punish that kind of behavior. And maybe this can be the last thought. When you're thinking about something like that, which is global in scale, I find it so insightful to shrink it down to what it would look like in the context of a small group. So just imagine a small group that's an Ostromian group, and a member of that group really does something predatory, like what Russia is doing on the world stage. What would the response be in an Ostromian group to such an individual? Well, there would be a collective response, big time, and that kind of thing just wouldn't be successful. If it happened, it wouldn't be successful. And that's why we're the cooperative species that we are. When you look at human genetic evolution, what caused us to become so cooperative at that tiny scale was social control. Read the work of Christopher Boehm and Richard Wrangham and so many others. It was because anti-bullying behavior. We just, in our ancestral human groups, if someone tried to get their way that way, they were successfully opposed. And therefore we became human. Therefore we became cooperative. Therefore we started to communicate symbolically. Therefore we had cultural evolution as a new evolutionary process. All thanks to cooperation, and cooperation was all thanks to social control. So what's happening now at a large scale is precisely what happened at a smaller scale. What's happening now with cultural evolution is precisely what happened with genetic evolution. This is the sense in which the evolutionary principles are just transcending any particular mechanism. And so there's a lot to think about there. And I think that the more people just adopt this view of life, this portal, and they just begin to learn about it, and it becomes intuitive for them, it becomes common sense, no more difficult than any other way of thinking, then the more this will just appear natural to them. They'll see the world that way, and they'll make much better moves than they're making now. So that basic evolutionary knowledge, before we get to the practicalities of what you should do in a group and the design principles and ACT and all of that stuff, in addition, just learn about this view of life. There's so much great material out there. I mean, so much to read about, and that's entertaining, and that all by itself will have an effect before you start applying it. And of course, let's do both of those things.
Absolutely, and then we can only hope, and I think there's good grounds for optimism that we will see more of a crossover into that kind of thinking, and that perhaps some of the prevalent ways of seeing the view, prevalent theories that you've been casting dispersions on during our talk, hopefully we see those as becoming a thing of the past and their disutility exposed for the world to see, because there is a better way, and I mean I can't help just taking it back to COVID. I mean, I can't claim credit for this because I haven't been resident in my homeland during the entire pandemic, but I go back to New Zealand, a country that's done extremely well,
yep.
By world standards in handling COVID, and the messaging from the very start was a team of 5 million. And I just thought that beautifully encapsulated. I mean, we're a sports mad nation, which I think helped the message resonate. Yep. But I think that way of putting it, a team of 5 million, beautifully captured, the collective and collaborative effort required to overcome something so once in a generation, so black swan like we've had with COVID, and actually just from a political point of view, it's been reflected in the polling. Jacinda Ardern, as many people know, is widely held up as this model of empathy as a world leader and so forth. Her favorability ratings, even among people who intended to vote for the opposition, were something like 70%. During the pandemic, even among people who at the next election are not going to vote for her party, people were still able to say, hey, look, you and your government have done a good job stewarding us through these stormy waters. I'm not saying the New Zealand experience of COVID has been perfect. There's been plenty to criticize about it. Yeah. But I think as an indication of the way we could be moving in the world, that's an example that and as a Kiwi as well, gives me a lot of room for optimism.
Yeah, and also, the political ideologies that we love to hate, when you look at them, you find that, really they're admirable, but typically at a smaller scale. So their group is not expansive enough, but for the most part, they're highly prosocial within their group. So you can't really criticize them as individuals. You have to be more systemic than that. And let me end, Gareth, by just, for anyone who's excited by what we've talked about and wants to get more involved, then the Prosocial Commons is a new group that is designed specifically to engage people in this and in ways that are highly aligned with their particular interests. And so you could just Google it. Google introducing the Prosocial Commons is one thing you can do. And you could provide the link, Gareth, in your liner notes. And there, if you join, you'll basically find a bunch of like-minded individuals. I hope that you'll join, Gareth, and then they can interact with you along with me in this view. Just to say a little bit more about it, it's organized in activity cycles. I'm very excited about this because this group is actually a bold experiment in cultural evolution all by itself. And so the people that come into this, it will be organized, first of all, they'll form subgroups that are interest-driven. And then those groups will take place over a cycle of activity, which we call a generation of activity. So there'll be a first generation, a second generation. There'll be Ostromian groups, and so we'll make sure of that. They'll employ ACT. We haven't talked much about ACT and the whole flexibility, adaptability component, but they'll be strong that way. So these groups will be strong groups because of our design principles. And then there'll be goal setting, so they'll have challenging but concrete goals. Then they'll do them together over this generation of activity. And then these will be researchable units in addition to work units. For continuous improvement, as we've as we've discussed. And at the end of the first generation, we'll take a break, we'll assess, we'll celebrate, we'll rest, and then there'll be the second generation. And it's designed to scale. So this could be 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people. It could scale. And so it's a very exciting experiment. And I would just love your listeners and viewers just to get involved. You can do it. And then wherever you are in your learning curve, from a total newbie all the way to a professor, there's lots of stuff to co-create, basically. So that's one of my newest projects that excites me a whole lot. And so I invite your viewers and listeners to get involved in what we are trying to create.
Well, count me in, and I'll echo those sentiments and just encourage everyone else to join along with me as well, because it's fabulous work, it's needed work, and we've all got to play our parts. So I will certainly be taking you up on that invitation, and I wholeheartedly encourage my listeners to do likewise. And David, that brings us to the end of our chat today. I mean, as expected, and as always, this was tremendously fun, tremendously illuminating. It's a true privilege to be able to call you a friend and colleague, and it's been a real honor having you join me today. I'm excited to continue collaborating with you in any areas that I myself might be of any service or value. So please do keep up all the excellent work that you do. I hope that Prosocial World continues. I know that Prosocial World will continue to grow from strength to strength, and that the fruits of your labor will continue to have such meaningful impact upon the world. So thanks again, and I really appreciate you joining me today.
Thanks to you, Dr. G, and so keep up the good work.
Will do. All right, cheers, David. And it got me thinking.